the desert wind moved softly through the ruins of Amarna, carrying with it whispers of a dynasty that once burned brightly, only to be extinguished far too soon. Among the shifting sands of memory, there is a story often overlooked, hidden beneath the grandeur of pharaohs and the gilded myths of Egypt's past. It is the story of Smenkhkare, a shadowy figure in the 18th dynasty, who stepped into history not as a conqueror or builder of monuments, but as a man bound by love, politics, and fate. His time was brief, his rule scarcely a year, and yet within that fragile moment, he was tethered to one of the most extraordinary families the world has ever known. Smenkhkare married Meritaten, the eldest daughter of the heretic king Akhenaten and his queen, the radiant Nefertiti. To be bound to Meritaten was to be tied directly to the legacy of revolution. For she was the child of a pharaoh who had dared to abandon the gods of his fathers, choosing instead to worship the singular sun disk Akhenaten had built an empire on faith and defiance, pulling Egypt away from centuries of tradition and placing it in the grip of his radical vision. Meritaten grew up in this world of shifting altars and trembling priests, where love of the Aten overshadowed the love of all other gods. Her marriage to Smenkhkare was not simply a union of two people. It was a symbol, a bridge intended to secure the fragile throne and anchor the Amarna dream. But who was Smenkhkare? The truth remains shrouded in mystery. Some whisper that he was Akhenaten's brother. Others believe he was merely a noble elevated for convenience, while still others imagine him as a co-regent, chosen to stabilize the throne during Egypt's most tumultuous experiment. Yet in Meritaten's eyes, he was not just a political piece on the chessboard of dynasties, he was her partner, her pharaoh. And for a short while, the living embodiment of Egypt's destiny. We must pause here and imagine the humanity that lies beneath the hieroglyphs. History so often erases the tender struggles of individuals, reducing lives to stone inscriptions and brittle papyri. Yet Smenkhkare and Meritaten were not lifeless statues. They were flesh, bone, and spirit. Picture the young queen, still carrying the beauty of her mother, standing beside a man who bore the heavy weight of expectations. Their marriage was likely filled with ceremony and gold, with chants rising into the night as priests invoked Otan's blessing. But behind the dazzling crowns and painted walls, there were quiet moments, shared glances, hushed words of worry, hopes for children, fears of betrayal, and the yearning to hold on to something real amid the storm of politics. For Smenkhkare's reign began in a time of fracture. Egypt was weary. The gods of old, cast aside by Akhenaten, were clawing their way back into the people's hearts. The priests of Ammon, long stripped of their power, were waiting for the moment to reclaim their throne behind the throne. Soldiers muttered in camps, the common people felt adrift, and the empire's enemies watched hungrily from beyond its borders. Into this fragile landscape stepped Smenkhkare, crowned as pharaoh, but already marked by the brevity of destiny. He was not given decades to carve monuments or lead armies into glorious battle. He was granted only a fleeting season, a single year that flickered like a candle flame, before the desert wind consumed it. And then he was gone. His death came suddenly, quietly, and to this day, historians can only speculate. Was it illness? Was it conspiracy? Was his youth stolen by the same shadows that haunt so many royal courts? For the people of Egypt, his absence was yet another wound in a time already bleeding from doubt and change. For Meritaten, his wife, it was a shattering loss. She had stood beside him as great royal wife, carrying the weight of dynastic duty, and then, in an instant, she was left alone, a widow, a queen without a king, a woman navigating a court of men who saw her more as a tool than as a soul. Yet Egypt could not rest, even in grief. The throne demanded another, and so arose Neferneferuaten. This figure, perhaps Nefertiti herself under a new name, perhaps another daughter of Akhenaten, took the crown and the burden of kingship. The lines blur, the identities collapse, and history leaves us only fragments. But one truth remains: Smenkkare's story was swallowed by time, his reign erased by the monumental power of those who came after. In just a year, he slipped into obscurity, leaving behind only whispers, faint inscriptions, and the shadow of Meritaten's mourning. And here lies the deeper meaning of his tale. Smenkkare's life is not only the story of an Egyptian pharaoh, is the story of how fragile power truly is. He wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, but it did not shield him from mortality. His name was inscribed on temple walls, yet still, he was forgotten by the sands. His marriage tied him to one of the most extraordinary families in history, yet still, he vanished from memory. His story forces us to ask, what is a legacy, if not the endurance of truth? What is a crown, if not a fleeting mask placed upon a fragile body? This is where his story echoes with the struggles of countless others across human history. For how many men and women have been erased simply because their time was short, their voices silenced, their presence inconvenient? How many lives have been swept aside by the powerful, their humanity forgotten? Smenkhkare is not only a pharaoh lost to time, he is a mirror of the forgotten, a reminder that history is written by those who survive, and too often, by those who oppress. Just as the priests of Amen worked to erase the Amarna experiment, so too has history erased the dignity of countless black lives. Countless stories of resilience and greatness, swept aside by systems of slavery, colonization, and prejudice. To remember Smenkhkare is to resist erasure. To speak his name is to breathe life back into the silenced. Just as remembering the voices of the oppressed is an act of defiance against forgetting, Meritaten herself becomes a symbol of survival in this narrative. She too has been overshadowed, often seen only as a daughter, a wife, a figure moved around the board by her father and husband. Yet in truth, she was a woman of strength, navigating a collapsing dynasty, enduring the loss of her partner, and witnessing the unraveling of her family's vision. In her silence, we find resilience. In her shadowed presence, we find echoes of countless women who bore their dignity through loss and injustice. And so, when we look upon the sands of Amarna and whisper Smenkkare's name, we are not only recalling a pharaoh who reigned for a year, we are remembering the fragility of power, the endurance of love, and the unyielding dignity of those who refused to be forgotten. His story, though short, reminds us that every life carries weight. Every existence has meaning, and even in erasure, there is truth waiting to be rediscovered. The court of Amarna, once filled with music, incense, and the glitter of sunlight on painted stone, grew quieter after Smenkkare's death. His absence left a void that no crown could fill. Meritaten, young yet already burdened with sorrow, stood alone in the palace halls where once she had walked beside him. The echoes of their shared laughter, Their whispered hopes for the future still clung to the walls, but they were only shadows now. For a queen in Egypt, grief could not last long. The throne had its own demands, its own cruel way of consuming the personal for the sake of the eternal. And so Meritaten watched as another rose to power. Neferneferuaten. Who was this ruler who followed? The mystery endures. Some believe it was Nefertiti herself, refusing to let her husband's vision die, taking the throne under a new name. Others argue it was another of Akhenaten's daughters, perhaps even Meritaten herself under a disguised identity. In either case, the transition was not gentle, nor was it secure. Egypt was still reeling from Akhenaten's radical abandonment of the old gods. And the priests who had once ruled the temples with iron authority were returning, step by step, to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. In this swirl of uncertainty, the brief light of Smenkhkare dimmed further. His reign became an interruption, a name barely recorded, a face barely remembered. His monuments, if they ever existed, were dismantled or altered, his inscriptions chiseled away, his memory deliberately erased in what the Egyptians called damnatio memoriotha, condemnation of memory. To erase someone's name from stone was to erase them from eternity, for in the Egyptian belief, to be remembered was to live forever. To have your name forgotten was to die a second death. This is the injustice that cuts deepest into Smenkhkare's story. His body may have fallen to time, but it was the deliberate hand of power that stripped his memory from history. He was not simply forgotten by accident, he was erased by design. And here lies the human truth that resonates across centuries. When the powerful seek to rewrite history, they begin by silencing those they deem inconvenient. It is the same hand that sought to bury the truth of enslaved peoples, to diminish the contributions of black civilizations, to erase the memory of leaders who resisted oppression. Erasure is violence. Silence is domination. And yet, even in silence, whispers endure. Meritaten's grief became part of those whispers. She was forced to continue living in a palace where loyalty was fragile, where her own place was uncertain. Some accounts suggest she may have been compelled to marry again, perhaps even to her own father, after Smenkhkare's death. Suggestion so haunting that it speaks to the desperation of a collapsing dynasty. Imagine the weight of that. A woman who had already given her heart and stood as great royal wife was forced to bend again. Her agency stripped, her body and name used as currency for power. This was the cruel truth of royal women in ancient courts, adored in titles, wrapped in gold, but too often treated as pawns in games of survival. And yet, Meritaten, like so many forgotten women across history, endured. Her silence is not weakness, it is resilience. We do not see her speeches recorded, nor her personal cries preserved, but her endurance in the shadows is itself an act of survival. She stands in history as a mirror of countless women whose lives have been shaped by forces larger than themselves, who bore loss and injustice, and who still carried themselves with dignity even when stripped of choice. The reign of Neferneferuaten that followed carried its own uncertainties. Whoever she was, she ruled as Pharaoh, an act rare and radical in its own right. But her time, too, was short. Within only a few years, the Amarna experiment collapsed completely. Tutankhaten, the boy king later, known as Tutankhamun, was placed upon the throne, and the gods of old returned in triumph. Aten's temples were abandoned. Amarna was left to the desert winds, and all that Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Smenkhkare, and Meritaten had endured, was swept away in a tide of restoration. And so, the question lingers. Why remember Smenkhkare at all? Why resurrect a pharaoh who ruled for only a year, who left no great monuments, no vast armies, no lasting reforms? The answer lies not in the size of his achievements, but in the weight of his humanity. His story is a reminder that every life, no matter how brief, no matter how forgotten, carries dignity. Smenkhkare may not have conquered nations or built temples that touched the sky, but he lived, he loved, he ruled, and he died. That alone makes him worthy of remembrance. To tell his story is to resist the violence of forgetting. It is to say, your life mattered. Your existence left an imprint, however faint. And when we speak his name, we are also speaking for the countless lives across history that were deliberately silenced, lives taken by slavery, colonization, injustice, and oppression. We are declaring that even if the powerful sought to erase them, they endure through memory, through the telling of stories, through the voices of those who refuse to let them be forgotten. Think of how many African kingdoms were diminished in European writings. How many leaders were painted as savages when in truth they were statesmen, visionaries, and warriors. Think of the black women whose names never appeared in history books, though their labor and love held families and communities together through centuries of bondage. Think of the men who resisted, who led revolts, who dreamed of freedom, only to have their stories suppressed. Their erasure was deliberate, just as Smenkkare's was deliberate. And yet here we are, centuries later, speaking their names again. That is the power of remembrance. That is the triumph of dignity over silence. In the quiet of Amarna's ruins, where the stone blocks crumble and the desert swallows the remnants of palaces, there is still something alive. The wind carries the whispers of names that once were spoken in prayer. Meritaten, Nefertiti, Akhenaten, and yes, Smenkhkare. Each name is a thread woven back into the fabric of memory. To walk among those ruins is to walk with ghosts, not the frightening kind, but the insistent kind. The kind who demand, do not forget us. Do not let the sands cover us forever. Smenkkare's story ends in mystery, but perhaps that is its greatest lesson. For in the absence of clear answers, we are compelled to imagine him, to humanize him, to see him not as a lost king, but as a man of flesh and spirit, who lived briefly and died too soon. In that imagining, we practice empathy. We breathe life into the forgotten, and we honor the truth that every life has value, no matter how obscured by time or power. And so, let us tell his story not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to the fragility of power, the endurance of love, the cruelty of erasure, and the resilience of memory. For in speaking of Smenkhkare, we do more than remember a pharaoh, we remember all who have been silenced. We declare that dignity is not given by monuments or by the length of reigns, but by the humanity carried within a single fleeting life. In the end, Smenkhkare may not have shaped Egypt's destiny in stone, but he has shaped ours in spirit. His brief reign reminds us that remembrance itself is an act of justice, and as long as his name is spoken, he is not erased. As long as we remember, neither he, nor Meritaten, nor any of the forgotten, will ever truly vanish.